Welcome back again. This will be the second episode of my new series about different mythologies from around the world. I am very excited for this one. Tonight, we are going to take a look at North American mythology. That means, of course, that it will be about Indian culture, spirits, legendary warrior heroes, and a lot of nature-based mythology, which I absolutely love. Going into this project, I did not know much about North American mythology at all, and I have learned a lot while creating the script for this video. It's really fascinating to me to learn about these things. It gives me a lot of insight in how people back in the days viewed not only spirituality, but it also gives insight in how they viewed life itself. Since spirituality is such a big part in how we live our lives, the structure is going to be much like the Egyptian video, several shorter fables from the North American mythology. And as always, if you actually enjoy your time here, then please leave me a like and perhaps a follow. It means the world to me and keeps me going, creating more videos for you guys. I sincerely hope you will like it. Now let's get started with the first chapter. Part 1, The First Americans. We will start with a fast little overview of some of the prominent tribes of North America. Before the Europeans came to North America, the Indians were the only human inhabitants of this land. They probably migrated from Siberia thousands of years ago and settled in different places, where some became hunters, some farmers, some fishermen, and some nomadic herders. The Europeans destroyed the traditional ways of life, but the myths have survived and been passed down from generation to generation, and they still constitute an important part of a living culture. The stories presented here are drawn from authentic sources, and they range from creation myths and explanations of events in nature or traditional moral values to the famous humorous animal tales. Archaeologists believe that the first inhabitants of America consisted of groups of hunters who crossed the Bering Strait from Siberia approximately 25,000 years ago. At that time, a large part of the continent was covered by ice, but as the inland ice gradually melted and retreated, people slowly moved southward until about 10,000 years ago they reached the southernmost tip of South America. When the last ice age came to an end, North America developed into a land of extraordinary variation and contrast. Since it stretches all the way from the Arctic tundra of northern Canada and Alaska to the subtropical regions of Florida and California, the natural landscape ranges from high mountain chains and dense forests to fertile river valleys and vast prairies, marshlands, and desert. The native peoples of North America lived under widely varying conditions depending on the regions they inhabited, and they developed skills and traditions that were best adapted to their natural surroundings and the resources available to them. In the far north, along the Arctic coasts, lived the Eskimos, a nomadic hunting people who depended on both land and sea for their livelihood. Seals, walruses, whales, and reindeer provided them not only with meat, but also with blubber and fat for warmth and light, as well as hides for clothing, shelters, and boats. In winter, seals and walruses were hunted through holes in the ice, while in summer, when the ice broke up, they were harpooned from light canoes known as kayaks. Whales were hunted from larger open boats capable of carrying 8 to 10 men. Eskimo clothing was extremely well adapted to protect against the harsh climate. In summer, seal skins were worn, while in winter warmer reindeer hides were preferred. Both men and women wore hooded parkas and trousers, boots and mittens, and when it was particularly cold, they often wore 2 layers of each garment. During the summer months, people lived in skin tents, but in winter, they built more permanent dwellings of stone, wood, and turf. Where these materials were unavailable, they constructed dome-shaped snow houses, or igloos, from tightly packed snow and blocks of ice. Typically, several families lived together in a larger house, or in a cluster of igloos connected by a shared entrance tunnel. Settlements often consisted of only 1 or 2 such family groups, except when several groups gathered together to hunt cooperatively or celebrate religious festivals. In the coastal regions where the Eskimos lived, there was almost no tree vegetation at all, but farther south vast forested areas spread out. The forest consisted of pine, spruce, larch, and cedar. The indigenous peoples who lived here were few in number and scattered over vast areas. They also lived by hunting and fishing, moving about in small groups during the long, dark winter months. But during the short summer, they gathered together in larger camps. Like the Eskimos, the indigenous peoples of the northern forests had to consume large amounts of food in order to withstand the cold and obtain enough energy to hunt. Reindeer, caribou, moose, bears, beavers, and hares were trapped or hunted with bow and arrow. Birds were caught in nets and snares, and around lakes fishing was an important source of nourishment, especially during seasons when other food was scarce. Most people lived in conical tents, made of hides or skins, which were easy to set up and transport, although in the western parts of the region more solid wooden houses were also built. Reindeer and moose hides were used for clothing and bedding, as well as for bags to transport goods and belongings. Other storage containers and cooking vessels were made from birch bark, which was shaped and sewn together using spruce roots. Birch bark was also used for canoes. Large sheets of bark were sewn onto wooden frames, and in summer, they were sealed with spruce resin to make them watertight. Birch bark canoes were very light and could easily be carried past waterfalls or from one waterway to another. In winter, people transported their belongings on sleds or toboggans, and they used snowshoes to prevent sinking into the snow. Along the rocky Pacific coast from southern Alaska to northern California, a significantly milder climate prevailed, with heavy rainfall, giving rise to dense forests and abundant vegetation. In this region, indigenous peoples were not dependent on warm clothing. From strips of cedar bark, they wove cloaks and wide-brimmed hats that protected against the rain, and for most of the year they went barefoot. Game was plentiful here. People caught fish with hooks, nets, and spears, and from canoes they harpooned seals, sea lions, and whales. Inland, they gathered wild plants and berries, and hunted animals such as deer, bears, and mountain goats, which were trapped or killed with bow and arrow. Because of the abundance of easily available food, the indigenous peoples had ample time to develop their artistic skills, particularly in wood carving. Canoes, cradles, chests, bowls, spoons, and many other objects were made of wood, and nearly everything was elaborately carved and painted, whether it was an everyday utilitarian object or a ritual item such as masks and rattles. Their large rectangular houses were also built of wood. Several families from the same clan, perhaps 30 or 40 people, lived together in each house, and larger villages consisted of 8 to 10 houses. Each house was led by a household chief, who in turn was subordinate to the village chief. Each village was independent and had its own land, fishing waters, and hunting grounds. There was no tribal chief or overall leader, although different villages might come together to celebrate festivals or wage war. Each village was divided into 3 social classes: chiefs or nobles, commoners, and slaves, who usually consisted of captives. There was a highly developed social hierarchy, based mainly on birth and family relationships, but wealth in the form of material possessions, such as blankets, ceremonial copper plates, and food stores, also played an important role. It was impossible to achieve high social status without first acquiring such wealth. When a chief wished to proclaim an important event, such as the birth of a child or a marriage, or when he was to settle an inheritance dispute, he would organize a special feast called a potlatch, to which he invited chiefs from other villages. On such occasions, the host demonstrated his power and wealth by giving away or even destroying his possessions. In order not to be outdone in generosity, the guests in turn had to hold equally lavish feasts. So the potlatch ceremony itself became a refined way of exchanging and giving away wealth. On the other side of the continent, around the Great Lakes and in the woodland region, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, indigenous peoples also lived in large, well-organized villages, often surrounded by timber palisades. Some lived in long rectangular wooden houses with rounded or sloping roofs made of straw or bark. Others lived in round dome-shaped dwellings called wigwams, constructed from bent poles covered with reed mats and hides. At times, villages united to wage war or conduct trade, but there was no central council governing an entire tribe. Even though people might be united by a common language and customs, or social structure and farming through kinship, each village was governed independently by an elected chief and a village council, which provided him with advice and assistance in maintaining law and order. The Indians in this area hunted, fished, and gathered wild plants like those in other regions, but they were primarily farmers who cultivated many varieties of maize, corn, beans, and squash in fields around the villages. It was these people who introduced maize, potatoes, and tobacco to the first European explorers and settlers. West of the Mississippi Valley, the rolling prairies and grasslands known as the Great Plains stretch all the way to the Rocky Mountains. The Indians living here belonged to many different tribes with distinct languages and customs. Yet, they had much in common. They were all dependent on the buffalo for food and raw materials, and on the horse as a pack animal. The horse existed in the New World, but became extinct long before the first Indians arrived. It was reintroduced by Spanish settlers in the 1500s, but it wasn't until the mid-1700s that the horse became common on the plains. Before then, buffalo and other game were hunted on foot. Often, many hunters worked together to surround a herd and drive them into an enclosure or off a cliff. Many tribes, especially on the eastern prairies, were farmers like the inhabitants of the eastern woodlands, growing maize and other plants. However, with the arrival of the horse, hunting became much easier, and most tribes abandoned agriculture to become nomadic hunters. Those who continued to farm built houses of wood and turf, but most Indians from the Great Plains lived in tipis, conical tents made of poles covered with buffalo hides. Clothing was also made from hides. Men wore jackets and leggings, while women wore long belted dresses. Clothes worn for ceremonial occasions were painted and decorated with fur, feathers, and porcupine quills, though the quills were later replaced by glass beads brought by white traders. Each tribe consisted of several related groups, each numbering 100 people or more. In autumn, the group separated and headed for the valleys and lower slopes of the Rocky Mountains to seek shelter from the cold winter winds sweeping down from the north. There they lived in camps led by a chief and his council of elders. When the weather warmed, they left their winter quarters for the open plains to hunt buffalo. By early summer, the groups within each tribe reunited to form a massive camp of several thousand people. In the center, inside the great circle of tipis, a special lodge was erected where chiefs and advisors could meet to plan hunting expeditions, war, and other activities. Warfare was a way to gain respect and status within the tribe. The goal was not necessarily to kill. It was considered braver and more honorable to steal an enemy's horses or weapons, or to wound him and escape unharmed, than to actually kill him. Warriors competed to perform such daring deeds. Southwest of the prairie land, the landscape changes dramatically. It consists largely of a high plateau of red and orange sandstone, broken by deep canyons and steep-sided, flat-topped hills called mesas, and giant cliffs shaped into fantastic forms by wind and rain. The mountain ranges are covered in pine and spruce forests, while groves of cedar and juniper grow on the lower slopes and in the valleys. Elsewhere lies semi-desert where the ground is baked hard and dry by the sun, and the only vegetation consists of cacti and small stunted bushes. Despite this, rainfall during the rainy season in the southwest is sufficient for farming, and the Pueblo Indians grew maize, vegetables, and fruit. These Indians were given the name Pueblo, the Spanish word for town, by Spanish explorers in the 1500s. They were impressed by the Indians' large villages built of stone and sun-dried brick. Adobe bricks. The villages consisted of large multi-story houses grouped around one or more courtyards. Many houses were built in terraces, so that each roof served as a balcony for the house above. To reach the upper floors, wooden ladders were used, which could be pulled up when danger threatened. The Pueblo Indians also grew cotton, which they spun and wove into blankets and clothing. Men wore cotton shirts and kilts, while women wore dresses and shawls. Each village or pueblo was ruled by a chief and a council. In some cases, the chief was appointed for life, but otherwise, he was elected annually. Often, Another chief was elected to oversee the village's defense and lead the warriors. Other tribes in the area, such as the Navajo, also farmed the land, but concentrated more on hunting deer and small game. They were nomads, and their dwellings consisted of temporary huts. In the summer, these were built of brushwood, and in the winter, of logs covered with earth. Their clothing was made of hides, though they sometimes traded for cotton garments from the Pueblo Indians. During the 1600s, Spanish settlers brought sheep and goats to the area. The Navajo became sheep herders, moving across the land in search of water and grazing pastures for their herds. Later, they learned to spin and weave the wool provided by these herds to make clothing. West of the Great Plains, between the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada, lies one of North America's most barren and inhospitable regions. Thanks to modern irrigation, this desolate landscape is not as barren today, but in the past, it was far too dry for farming using indigenous methods. The tribes living there were among the poorest in the country, but thanks to their knowledge of nature, they did not starve. The low, scrubby vegetation provided their most important food, seeds, roots, and nuts, as well as building materials for fragile brush huts. Deer were scarce in this area, so the Indians utilized whatever game was available, hunting rabbits, lizards, rats, and birds. Even larvae and grasshoppers served as food. The hunt for food meant these Indians were constantly on the move. A small group might camp by a field of wild grain, and in a week or so, they would have harvested it completely. Then they moved on, traveling primarily on foot. Most of their clothing was made of grass and bark, but for the colder seasons, they wove blankets from strips of rabbit skin and occasionally managed to obtain skin clothing from the Plains tribes. Beyond the Sierra Nevada, in what is now California, the Indians lived an equally simple life. But here food was more plentiful and life was easier. The staple diet consisted of a thin porridge made from crushed boiled acorns, and the sea provided a variety of fish and shellfish. This abundance of vegetation not only made the search for food less time-consuming, but also provided women with materials for basket weaving, a craft they developed to perfection. They created beautifully woven baskets for all sorts of purposes. Especially beautiful were the baskets meant to be given as gifts or used in ceremonial festivities. These were often decorated with bands of mussel shells or entirely covered in brightly colored feathers. Just as the lives of North American Indians differed from one region to another, so did their beliefs and myths, as these reflected their perception of the world. Hunting tribes, for example, had many tales of animal spirits, while those who farmed were more interested in the beings who, according to their belief, controlled the rain and the growth of crops. All these spirits had to be treated with respect and caution, although one could call upon their help when needed. They could also become dangerous. There were many complicated rules of conduct that had to be followed, so the spirits would not be offended and call down storms, disease, famine, or other misfortunes to paralyze humanity. Hunters, for instance, often treated the animals they killed with great solemnity, so their spirits would be appeased and return to be hunted again. Those who broke the rules and insulted the spirits could cause hardship not only for themselves, but for the entire village. Many Indian myths explain the origin of these rules and how they must be obeyed. Other stories tell how people can receive help from the spirits through personal contact. Young men wishing to make their way in the world often sought this help by seeking out remote and desolate places in solitude to fast and pray for guidance. After abstaining from food and water for several days, they often received visions where spirits appeared to help them and initiate them into rituals that would bring health and prosperity. A man blessed with special help from the spirits could become a medicine man or shaman, using his knowledge for the well-being or misfortune of others. Shamans were believed to have the power to control the spirits and to mediate between them and humans. In difficult times, people turned to the shamans to find out why the spirits were dissatisfied and how to resolve the situation. The shaman's primary task was to diagnose and cure diseases, but through their connection with the spirits, they could also predict the weather, indicate where game could be found, or call down a curse upon an enemy or an evildoer. Sometimes they accompanied the warriors to help them achieve victory. The The word shaman is a general term, but many tribes have their own specific titles, such as medicine man or medicine woman, or holy person, like the Hawaii in Navajo. Many myths and legends were considered sacred and could only be retold by certain people, while others were intended purely for entertainment and could be told by anyone. Stories were told during long winter evenings when people sat gathered around campfires and had time to listen. This was also the time when the animals, according to the Indians, were asleep and could not be offended by hearing stories that poked fun at them or portrayed them in a bad light. This is a very common cultural protocol among many tribes, like the Anishinaabe or Lakota. It was believed that spirits and certain animals were active in the summer and might overhear and take offense at stories about them. Much has changed for the Indians since the first European settlers arrived during the 1500s. Today, not much remains of their original way of life. Rifles have long since replaced bows and arrows, and motorized transport has largely replaced sledges, canoes, and horses. Old hunting grounds have given way to large industrial cities. Hide clothing is rarely used, except on special occasions or for the benefit of tourists. Even though many Indians still farm, hunt, and fish on the reservations assigned to them during the 1800s, their equipment is largely modern and factory-made. Others have moved to cities to find work far from their ancestral lands. Many symbolic ceremonies have fallen out of use, and myths have been forgotten. They were never written down, though some are preserved in other ways, for example, through totem poles or sand paintings. Despite this, a large number of myths live on. During winter evenings by the campfire, while the animals sleep, those who still remember continue to teach their listeners about the customs and values of their ancestors. While the text mentions these together, they come from very different regions. Totem poles are primarily from the Pacific Northwest, Haida, Tlingit, for example, and serve as family crests or historical records. Sand paintings are a sacred healing art form primarily associated with the Navajo in the Southwest. Part 2. The Arrival of the Raven. The world of the Inuit was full of spirits. The most powerful were the spirits of the sea, the moon, and the air, but there were also many others. The Inuit believed that everything in nature, animals, mountains, lakes, even cliffs and stones, had a soul or spirit that could be pleased or angered by human actions. One had to be extremely cautious not to wound the spirits of the animals that were hunted for the sake of food, because it was believed that animals from the sea did not like coming into contact with animals on land. It was forbidden to eat seal and reindeer meat on the same day, or even to sew reindeer skin clothing during the same day that one hunted seal, walrus, and whale. If these laws were not followed, the animals would not allow themselves to be hunted. To entertain and appease the spirits of the dead animals, special feasts and ceremonies were held. One such was the Bladder Festival. An animal's soul was considered to have its seat in the animal's urinary bladder. So when the hunter killed an animal, he carefully removed the bladder and saved it until the time for the festival had arrived. During great celebrations, the urinary bladders were inflated and hung in a special festival house. After much singing and dancing and the offering of food, the bladders were then taken down and pushed through a hole in the ice so that the souls could return to the sea and take their place in the bodies of unborn animals and come back to allow themselves to be hunted again. If these ceremonies were not performed correctly, the animal spirits would feel neglected, and there would be a shortage of game. At the beginning of the year, before the hunting season began, the Inuit held another festival where they wore animal masks to please the animals and encourage them to return. Spirits from dead people could also become dangerous if one did not take the proper measures. The dead had to receive all the things in the grave that they might eventually need in the next world, such as clothes, food, tools, and weapons. If someone died of natural causes, his soul traveled to the narrow land at the bottom of the sea. If one died a violent death, the soul flew up to the land of day in the sky, in the direction of the dawn. In these lands, the spirits lived in much the same way as during their earthly life. In the land of day, Life was particularly happy and carefree. And when the northern lights flared in the sky, it was believed the dead occupied themselves with their favorite sport, football with walrus skulls. Regular festivals were held for the souls of the dead, so that their relatives could honor them with song and dance and offerings of food, water, and clothes. If this was not done, the souls could return to the earth as evil spirits. Many of the Inuits' myths and legends deal with these spirits, who were believed to exist everywhere around them, or with forces of nature that they had difficulty explaining. Because the Inuit lived in small, isolated groups, the stories vary from place to place. For example, there were different opinions on how the earth had been created. In some areas, the Inuit believed that it had always existed, and that the first humans came from the sky or the earth's interior. But in Alaska, it was believed that the earth and everything on it had been created by the raven. In the beginning, there was only darkness. Yet inside this darkness, the raven already existed. He was then still small and weak, and his special abilities were not fully developed. In fact, he did not even know that he possessed special abilities. He sat huddled on the ground in the darkness and listened. There were no sounds. There was nothing. He groped around. The ground was hard and bare. Cautiously at first, and then with growing self-confidence, he crawled forward over the ground. Everywhere it seemed the same, hard and cold. But as he moved forward, things began to come to life behind him. Water seeped out from cracks. It rose and formed streams and rivers. Hills and mountains shot up out of the earth. When the raven returned to the place where he had started, he found to his surprise a forest with thick ground vegetation of grass and ferns. Encouraged by this, he decided to explore the terrain further away. But before he had reached particularly far, he stopped and drew back in terror. The ground had disappeared. He stood at the edge of a gaping abyss, and in front of him, there was nothing other than empty space. He sat down to rest under a tree and tried to understand how it all fit together. Who was he? Why did things start to grow around him? And what was found below the abyss? He flapped his wings where he sat at the edge of the precipice, and he could feel how his strength and power increased in them. Suddenly he understood everything. He knew who he was. He was Tulugokuk, the Raven Father, creator of all life. With a triumphant craa, craa, he lifted his wings and glided down into the silent, mysterious darkness. Deep down there, he found another land, which was so new that the earth's crust had barely had time to solidify. The raven called this land Earth, and the land he had left behind him, Heaven. The earth lay bare and desolate, just as the heavenly land had done, but the raven made it come to life through his mere presence. And soon, this land too was covered with trees, grass, plants, and flowers. But everything still lay wrapped in darkness. Suddenly, he caught sight of something bright that was glimmering. He bent down and discovered a gold-shimmering object half hidden in the earth. When he scraped away the soil, the light became stronger. Much, much stronger. While the raven shielded his eyes from the sharp light, he threw the golden object up into the air, and suddenly, the earth was illuminated by flowing sunshine. Now the raven could see his creation. It was a wonderful land with snow-covered mountain peaks, forests, and tree-covered slopes, with rolling grasslands and valleys and many rivers, lakes and streams that glistened and shone in the clear sunlight. The raven wandered proudly around in the new, beautiful land and observed his creation. When he came to the sea, he saw a giant, winding vine. It was much larger than the others, tall as a birch, and covered with pale green pea pods. Suddenly one of the pea pods burst with a loud crack, and out tumbled a human. Terrified by this sudden appearance, the raven took a leap backward. On the ground sat the first Eskimo, and rubbed his eyes from the strong sunlight. "Indeed," cried the raven. "When I created the vines, I could never have believed that something like this would come out of them." When they had both recovered from their surprise, the raven showed the human what he had done. "Are you hungry?" asked the raven. "These berries here are good to eat." The human ate the berries, but still felt hungry, and the raven realized that more substantial food was required. When he had thought for a while, He took a lump of clay from the riverbed and formed two small animals with short, powerful legs and long, curved horns. He lowered his wings over them for a few moments, and when he lifted his wings again, two large musk oxen galloped away across the grasslands. In the same way, the raven also created the first pair of reindeer, but because he did not let the clay dry long enough before he flapped his wings, the reindeer's coat remained brown and white speckled, as it is today. "I shall teach you how to manufacture bows of wood and sinew," said the raven to the human, "and arrows with bone tips, so that you can hunt these animals for food. But be careful," he added. "You must not hunt too many, for then they will become scarce, and you will go hungry. The animals will be your friends in many ways if you only treat them with respect." For several days, Raven went around and created all sorts of animals, birds, and fish, and explained how they could be used for man. He told him which were best as food, and which had the finest skins. He showed him the fierce bear, so that man would learn fear and caution. Some of the animals Raven created, such as the peppercorn-eyed shrew or the jumping water beetle, had no practical function, but Raven believed they would help make the world pleasant and lively. Raven thought that man might feel lonely without company, so he decided to give him a companion. He made a little clay figure that was quite similar to the first man, and she was given hair of fine grass. Raven flapped his wings, and there stood the first woman. Man learned to build houses of wood and turf, to manufacture canoes of hides, and sleds of wood and bone. He discovered that one could make fire with the help of a dry stick and a leather strip, and thus began using fire to warm himself and cook food. His wife made needles from bone and thread from sinew, and learned to sew warm clothes and strong, waterproof shoes from hides. When their first child was born, Raven took him to the river and smeared him with clay, so that he would become strong and healthy. So great was Raven's power that the child was already running around the following day, and the day after that, he was a full-grown man. An additional 3 Eskimos fell out of the pea pods on the giant beach pea, and Raven did the same for them as he had done for the first man. Over and over again, he repeated his warning about hunting too many animals. These people's children also grew very quickly, just like their children and grandchildren in turn, so that people soon became very numerous, and their villages grew up everywhere in the land. The people followed Raven's laws closely, and they became bold and skilled hunters. Soon, they were no longer even afraid of the bear. Then, they became even bolder and finally greedy. They forgot Raven's warning and began killing far too many animals, significantly more than they needed. Raven reproached them. "Hard times are coming," he warned. "The animals you do not kill, you will drive away." But the people, who now thought they were stronger than Raven, did not care about him. And Raven, who was angry and disappointed, decided to leave Earth forever and return to the Skyland. And to punish the people for their disobedience, he took the sun with him after he had wrapped it in a reindeer skin sack. Now the earth lay once more wrapped in darkness, and the people became very terrified, as they could no longer see to hunt and fish. They fell into swamps and rivers and lost their way even in their own villages. Now and then, Raven felt sorry for them and brought out the sun for a day or two so that they could hunt a little. Afterward, he hid it again, so that darkness and confusion reigned once more. In the Skyland, Raven himself took a wife, a young snow goose. They had a son, Raven Boy, of whom they were very proud. Sometimes Raven used to show him the sun to amuse him. The young raven was fascinated by the glowing thing and longed to have it as a toy. One day, while Raven was taking a midday nap, Raven Boy snuck up to the chest where the sun was kept. Carefully, he lifted the skin sack, but at that very moment, Raven woke up. In a panic, Raven Boy threw himself toward the door, flapped his wings, swung out into the darkness, and took the sun with him. Raven rushed after him and begged him to come back, but his sun only flew higher and higher. Raven feared he intended to keep the sun for himself and called after him, "Do not hide the sun forever. Let it shine over the earth sometimes." High up in the sky, Raven Boy heard his father's words, and he took the sun out of the sack and put it back in its old place, so that light would once more return to the earth. But it was not the same constant light as before, For Raven Boy was afraid that if the people forgot the horrors of darkness, they would also forget everything Raven had taught them. So with a sweeping wing movement, he set space and the sun in motion around the earth. And that's the story of how the day and night were created. Part 3. Sedna, the spirit of the deep sea. Sedna, the spirit of the sea, was once an ordinary mortal girl who lived with her father by the sea. She was very beautiful, and many suitors came bringing gifts to win her favor. But Sedna was very proud and arrogant and wanted none of them. There was always something wrong. One was too short. Another had bad teeth. She rejected their gifts and turned her back on them. She did not even want to speak with them. This behavior made her father furious. "Why can't you get yourself a husband like other girls?" he asked impatiently. "I need a son-in-law who can help me hunt, now that I am old." Sedna only turned away with a carefree shrug of her shoulders and brushed her long dark hair while she hummed. Finally, when yet another young man had left wounded and distressed by Sedna's cruel behavior, her father lost his patience. "The next man who comes here," he said, raging, "you will marry. Next time I will force you. You will not be able to refuse one more time." He did not have to wait long. Already the following day, a strange kayak appeared at the beach. In the kayak sat a tall young man, dressed in bushy, dark skins. His head was covered by a large hood, and his face was half hidden by a wooden mask as protection against the snow. Sedna's father hurried down to the beach and dragged his struggling, protesting daughter after him. Before the stranger had even had time to step out of the boat, the old man shouted, "Are you, perhaps, in search of a wife? Then look here, my daughter, Sedna. She will be an excellent wife for you. She is young and beautiful, and can both cook and sew." The young man smiled. "I have heard much talk of your daughter's beauty," he nodded, "and I have come to make her acquaintance." He turned to Sedna and continued, "In my homeland, I own a large and magnificent house where the walls are lined with firs as protection against the storms. If you marry me, you shall sleep on soft bare rugs and eat only the finest food." Sedna looked at the young man where he sat tall and straight-backed in his kayak. "Well, if I must marry, then I suppose I must," she thought reluctantly. "He seems kind and is not too ugly. It could be worse." There was truly not much she could do about the matter, for her father had made up his mind, and without saying another word, he tucked her down into the kayak. The young man took his paddle and pushed the canoe out into the water. They traveled for a long time over the ice-cold sea. Sedna, who was angry and sad, said nothing, and the young man did not seem inclined toward conversation either. The only thing heard was the lapping of the waves against the kayak, and a lone seabird that now and then shrieked over the water. They traveled further and further away, until finally a rocky island rose out of the mists. "Look," said the young man, "there lies my home." Sedna was terrified. The island appeared to be desolate and inhospitable. Nothing grew on the stony beaches, and seabirds circled around the cliffs and filled the air with their wild, lamenting cries. The young man paddled into shallow water and hopped ashore. He threw back his hood and took off his snow mask. Sedna looked at him in astonishment. He was incredibly ugly, short and hunched over, and his eyes were small and red-rimmed. The fact that he had previously looked tall depended only on the high seat in the kayak. He saw Sedna's terrified expression and burst into a harsh, cackling laugh. "Come," he shouted and pulled her roughly by the arm. "Come and look at my fine house, your new home." But it was not fine at all. It was nothing other than a pile of twigs and driftwood high up on a cliff ledge. There were no soft fur skins, such as the young man had promised, but only a few miserable fish skins that lay stretched out on the coarse stone floor. Sedna looked at her new man, and right before her eyes, he was transformed into a small coal-black bird. Too late, she realized the truth. It was not a man she had married, but a storm petrel in human disguise. Sedna bitterly regretted her foolish pride, which had led her to this terrible place. The nest on the cliff-top was cold and uncomfortable, and there was nothing to eat but fish. But since she had no way to fly, Sedna lived for a long time with the storm petrel on the rocky island. During the days, he left the nest in his bird form and flew out over the sea to search for food. When he returned in the evening, he became a man again. In the meantime, Sedna's father, who regretted that he had been so hasty, set out to look for her, and after many days' journey, he reached the desolate cliff where the storm petrel lived. When he saw his daughter's misery, he was seized by remorse. "Oh, my poor child," he cried. "I never intended for you to suffer such a fate. You have truly been punished enough. Let us return home immediately." They quickly climbed into the kayak and set off. But before they were out of sight, Sedna turned around and saw a black dot silhouetted against the sky. "Father! Father!" she shrieked. "My husband is coming back. When he sees that I am gone, he will surely follow us. What will become of us?" The old man pushed her down into the bottom of the kayak and covered her with hides. Fear drove him on, and he paddled as fast as he could, and the kayak flew forward over the waves. In the twilight, the storm petrel came, sweeping closely above the water's surface on stiff, outstretched wings. Despite Sedna lying hidden under the bundle of hides, he knew she was there. Wildly shrieking, he circled round and round above the kayak. At first, the old man took no notice of him, but the bird made a sudden dive and lashed the sea with his wings so that it became black and violent, and large waves began to wash over the kayak. The old man screamed and struck at him with a paddle, but the bird threw himself aside and glided forward over the water's surface and lashed furiously with his wings, so that the storm raged ever more fiercely, and the sea was transformed into a boiling cauldron that tossed the kayak here and there like a toy and threatened to swallow it completely. The old man, who feared for his life, lost his senses and dragged the terrified girl from her hiding place. "Here, you have your wife," he shouted. "You can fetch her yourself." And then he threw her overboard. Sedna screamed in horror and clung to the kayak. But her father, who was out of his mind with terror, struck her fingers with the paddle, so that the outer knuckles, which were stiff with cold, snapped off like icicles and fell into the water. There they were transformed, as if by a miracle, into seals, which dove and somersaulted in the waves. Sedna begged for her life and clung to the kayak again. But once more her father tried to make her let go, and this time her fingers were snapped off at the middle joint. These also fell into the sea, and became the first walruses. With bleeding finger stumps, Sedna made one last desperate attempt to grab hold of the kayak's edge, but her father would not be moved, and struck off the last bit of her fingers, which were transformed into whales that followed the seals and walruses down into the depth. Now Sedna no longer had any fingers to cling with, and she sank to the bottom of the sea. The storm petrel circled the kayak and mourned his lost wife. Then he turned around and flew back to his gloomy island. But Sedna did not drown. Instead, she became the spirit of the sea and the mother of sea creatures. According to legend, she still lives on the seabed, where she watches over the creatures that were created from her fingers with jealous care. But because of her father's cruelty, she cannot feel any love for humans. She suffers from their evil deeds, which cause wounds on her body and attack her hair like lice. Since she has no fingers, she cannot brush it, and it becomes tangled and dull. As revenge for this, she stirs up storms to prevent people from hunting, or she keeps the sea animals for herself. At such times, the shamans must travel to the Sea Kingdom to confess the sins of humanity and beg her for forgiveness. Only the most powerful, who fear nothing, can undertake this journey, for the way there is long and dangerous and blocked by large rolling boulders, and evil spirits guard the entrance to the Sea Mother's sealskin tent. To soothe Sedna's wrath and pain, the shaman must first comb her hair until it is clean and soft again. Thereafter, Sedna may feel more kindly disposed and releases the whales, walruses, and seals from the large basin under her lamp, so that humans for a short time may hunt freely and without fear until they forget and begin to sin again. Part 4. The Origin of Winds. Long ago, when the world was still very young, there were no winds at all, whether lukewarm summer winds or raging winter storms. Everything was completely still. There was no rustling in the reeds, and the snow fell straight down toward the earth instead of blowing and swirling up into drifts, as it does now. At that time, an old couple lived in a village at the mouth of the Yukon River. They had no children, and it made them very sad. Often the woman used to sigh and say, "How happy we would be if we only had a child." Then her husband would also sigh and answer, "Yes, if we had a son, I would teach him to hunt bear and seal out on the ice floats, and to manufacture traps and snares. How will it go for us when we become old, without anyone who looks after us? Who shall hold festivals for our souls when we are dead?" They brooded much over these questions, and during many long winter evenings they sat in the flickering light from the fire and fantasized about how different everything would be if they only had a child. One night, the woman had a strange dream where she saw a sled pulled by 3 dogs, 1 brown, 1 white, and 1 black, drive up in front of her front door. The driver leaned forward toward her and waved. "Come," he said, "sit here beside me. I shall take you on a journey." Surprised and afraid, the woman did as she had been told. She had barely had time to sit down before the driver cracked the whip, and the sled lifted high up into the air. Faster and faster they flew through the night-black space, and the stars shimmered like hoarfrost as they traveled past. The woman was no longer afraid, for she understood that this must be Igaluk, the spirit of the moon, who often came to comfort those who were having a hard time. Suddenly, the sled stopped, and the panting dogs lay down to rest. In all directions, as far as one could see, a vast ice plain stretched out, and the only thing that broke the glittering surface was a small, stunted tree. Igaluk pointed toward the tree and said, "You who long so much for a child, look at that tree over there. Make a doll from the trunk, and you will become happy." Before the woman had time to know more, she woke up. Her dream had been so vivid that she immediately woke her husband. She told him what she had seen and asked him to search for the tree. The man rubbed the sleep from his eyes. "What use would that be?" he muttered. "It would only be a doll, and not a real child." But the woman insisted, and finally the man took his axe on his shoulder and went to look for the tree. On the outskirts of the village, where the snow lay thick and undisturbed, he saw a glowing path that stretched far away into the distance. It was now full day, but the path still shone like moonlight, and the man understood that he must follow it. For many hours he traveled along the path of light, until he finally saw a brightly shining object on the horizon. When he came closer, he saw that it was the tree his wife had spoken of. The man cut it down with the axe and carried it home. That evening he carved a little boy figure out of a piece of the tree, while his wife sewed a little outfit of sealskin, and when the doll was finished, she dressed it and placed it on the seat of honor on the bench directly opposite the door. From the remaining wood, he carved a few toy bowls and some small weapons, a spear and a knife with bone tips. His wife filled the bowls with food and water and placed them in front of the doll. Before the couple went to bed, they sat and looked at the doll. Despite it being only 6 inches high, it looked very lifelike, with its eyes made of small ivory splinters. "I don't understand why we've gone to all this trouble," the man muttered. "Everything is exactly as before." "Perhaps so," replied his wife, "but at least we have received something to be happy about and to talk about." During the night, the woman woke up suddenly. She heard several low-pitched whistles nearby. She rushed to her husband and said, "Did you hear? That was the doll." They hurried up and quickly lit the lamp, and in the faint glow they saw that the doll had eaten the food and drunk the water. They saw that it breathed and moved its eyes. The woman lifted it into her arms and hugged it. They played with the doll for a while, until it became sleepy. Then they carefully put it back on the bench and went to lie down, delighted with their new toy. But in the morning when they woke up, the doll was gone. They rushed out and saw his footprints leading away through the village. They followed for as far as they could, but at the edge of the village, the footprints in the snow stopped, and the doll had disappeared without a trace. Sadly, the couple returned home, but the doll now followed the same path of light the man had walked the day before. He walked and he walked until he finally reached the eastern horizon, where the sky lowers itself toward the earth and blocks the light. When the doll looked up, he saw a hole in the sky that was covered with a piece of skin. The skin bulged inward, as if there was some mighty force on the other side. The doll, who became curious, drew his knife and cut through the ropes holding the skin in place and pushed it aside. Instantly, a mighty wind rushed in, sweeping with it birds and animals. The doll looked in through the hole, and on the other side, he saw the skyland, which looked exactly like the earth with mountains, trees, and rivers. When he thought the wind had blown enough, he pulled the piece of skin back over the hole and said with a stern voice, "The wind blows hard sometimes, and softly sometimes, and sometimes not at all." And so he went further. When he reached the southern horizon, he saw another piece of skin covering a hole in the sky wall, and it also bulged out like the first one. Again he drew his knife, and this time a warmer wind blew in, bringing with it more animals, trees, and bushes. After a while, the doll covered the opening with the same words as the first time, and continued westward. There he again saw a similar opening, but as soon as he had cut the ropes, the wind brought a fierce storm with waves and foam from the great ocean on the other side. The doll hurried to cover the hole and instructed the wind in the same way he had done with the other winds. When he came to the north, the cold was so biting that he hesitated for a moment before he dared to open the hole found there in the sky. When he finally did so, a violent gust of wind came with large drifts of snow and ice, so that the doll in an instant froze to the marrow and closed the opening very quickly. He admonished the winds in the same way as before, and now set off inland, away from the horizon, and he continued walking until he reached the very center of the earth's surface. There he saw the sky arch over the earth, like a giant tent supported by high, slender pillars. The doll was satisfied now that he had seen the whole world, and decided to return to the village where he had started. His foster parents were very happy when they saw him, for they had feared he had left them forever. The doll told them, and all the inhabitants of the village, about his travels, and how he had released the winds into the world. All were satisfied, for with the winds came game. The winds took birds with them in the air and animals on land, and they moved the ocean currents so that one could find seals and walruses everywhere along the coast. Because the doll brought luck with him, just as the moon spirit had predicted, special festivals were held in the doll's honor thereafter. The shamans manufactured dolls that resembled him, in the belief that they would assist them in their magical practices. And parents made dolls for their children, because they knew that they bring luck to those who care for them. Part 5. The Women and the Giant. The Eskimos usually explain their strange stories by saying that they stem from a time when incredible things could occur. At that time, the earth was inhabited by fantastic monsters, such as, for example, Amikuk, a large, slimy sea serpent, and Aziwagam, a dog-like animal with a black, scaly body and a tail that was so strong it could kill with a single blow. There was the evil Palrajuk, a strange dragon-like creature, as well as a whole family of grotesque, half-human beings called Kukulalawite, who, with their long, razor-sharp claws, tore apart anyone who had the misfortune to come in their way. Fortunately, there were also other, less evil beings, such as, for example, the shadow people who were totally invisible to the human eye. Only the shadows on the ground betrayed their presence. In the mountains, there were ill-tempered dwarves who lay in wait for unsuspecting passers-by to trip them. Their victims rarely managed to catch a glimpse of them, for they were incredibly fast-footed and could outrun any animal whatsoever. Furthest up in the north lived a kind of giants who were so large that their heads were hidden among the clouds. In a single stride, they could cross wide rivers and mountain ranges, and when they hunted, they hung bears and reindeer in their belts. In the same way, an ordinary human would hang up mice. But despite them being so large, they were generally harmless. Indeed, even friendly and helpful when needed. Once, a lonely woman happened to meet such a giant when she was on her way across the snow-covered tundra. She had a few days earlier fled from her cruel husband, whose evil had made him hated and feared by everyone in their home village. The smallest little thing could make him furious, and he was constantly in feuds with the neighbors. The children became afraid and hid when he came, and even his own dogs growled when they heard his footsteps. He was particularly brutal toward his wife, whom he constantly insulted and harassed and often struck. Finally, she could stand it no longer, and one snowy winter night, while her husband lay sleeping, she packed a small basket with food, put on shoes and mittens, and snuck quietly out of the house. Her heart pounded hard in her chest, for she knew that if the dogs barked and woke her husband, he would beat her like never before. To her relief, it was completely quiet in the village, and soon she had left it far behind her. Throughout that night, and several days thereafter, she wandered through the snow without meeting a single person. She avoided the villages that she saw in the distance, because she did not dare to entrust herself to strangers for fear that they would force her to return home again. While she wandered, the wind became increasingly biting, and the cold increasingly severe. Her meager food supply was soon exhausted, and she was forced to eat snow to still her hunger. Just as she was about to collapse from cold and hunger, she happened to stumble over a pile of freshly slaughtered reindeer meat, which lay half hidden under the snow. She could hardly believe her eyes. It had clearly been hidden there by some hunters who intended to return at a later time to fetch their catch. The woman looked around, but could see no one. There is so much food here, she thought. So surely it cannot do any harm if I take a little of it. She hastily gathered a few sticks and made a fire in the shelter of a mountain nearby and roasted some of the meat. When she had eaten her fill and rested, she felt much stronger, and she put the rest of the roasted meat in her basket and set off up the mountain. It truly looked strange there, for the mountain was roughly like a human foot, with 5 hills lined up along the crest. When the woman reached the top, it began to get dark, and she decided to set up camp for the night. She brushed away the snow between 2 of the hills and sat down. It was surprisingly warm and comfortable, and the woman slept well until morning. During the 3 following days, the path sloped gently upward toward the north. Each evening she managed to find a comfortable place to set up camp. The first night she slept in the shelter of a low hill. The second night she lay comfortably curled up in a deep pit. Toward the evening of the 3rd day, she found herself deep within a dense, dark forest. The undergrowth was dense and snowy, but it gave a warm bedding, and she slept well all night. Next morning, just as she was about to set off again, she heard a harsh voice thundering from somewhere above. "Who are you? What are you doing here? No people ever comes here." Terrified, the woman realized that she had, during the last days, wandered across the body of a sleeping giant, and that she had slept the first night between his toes, then under his knee, so in his navel, and now in his beard. It must have been the giant's reindeer meat that she had roasted and eaten that first evening. Despite the woman being close to fainting from fear, she still managed to stammer out her story. Again, the deep voice was heard. "You may stay here if you wish, but you must never again stay so close to my mouth, for if I should happen to breathe on you, you would blow far, far away." The woman understood that the giant did not wish her any harm, and her fear diminished. "You must be hungry after such a long journey," the giant continued. "Wait here so you can have something to eat." Suddenly, the sky darkened, and the woman saw a large cloud coming toward her. She drew back trembling, but it was only the giant's hand which opened and dropped some reindeer meat in front of her feet. "You can make a fire from straws from my beard?" he said kindly. "I can easily do without a few gray bristles." When the woman had finished eating, the giant said apologetically, "I am afraid that a little frost has gathered in my lungs during the night, and I must cough to get rid of it. Climb down to the thickest part of my beard and hold on tight. Hurry up, I can't wait any longer." Hardly had the woman done as the giant said, before she heard a fearsome roar, and a violent wind rushed over her head, followed by a blinding snowstorm. "Ah, now it feels better," said the giant, and the air became clear again. The two soon became good friends. The giant, whose name was Kinnak, let the woman live beside his nose, at a safe distance from his mouth, and he let her build a hut from hair strands from his beard. He provided food so that it sufficed for them both. He only needed to reach out his hand and catch a reindeer or deer or seal or whatever he wanted. He also caught bears, wolves, and foxes so that the woman could have warm clothes, and she soon had a beautiful supply of hides and skins. So they lived for a time as the best of friends. Then it happened that the woman thought of her husband and wondered if he missed her and was sad that he had driven her away. Kinak noticed that she sometimes looked sad and thoughtful, and one day he asked her if she wanted to return home. "Yes," the woman admitted, "but I'm so afraid that my husband will beat me again." "Don't be afraid," Kinak answered. "I shall protect you. Whenever you are in danger, you only need to call my name, and I will rescue you." Kinak then told the woman to cut off his earlobes of all the skins she had collected and to place them in her basket. When that was done, he asked her to curl up by his lips and close her eyes. Immediately a powerful, snowy gust of wind came, and the woman felt herself lifted up and carried away through the air, like a feather by Kinak's breath. When the wind finally let her go, and she stood on solid ground again, she opened her eyes. She was back in the village and stood in front of her old home. She placed the basket with the earlobes in the storehouse and went into the house. The husband, who sat by the fire, jumped up in consternation, for he had long believed she was dead, and now took her for a ghost. When he had heard her story, he was happy that she had come back, and he promised to never mistreat her again. When he went out to the storehouse the next morning, he found to his surprise that it was filled with warm skins. For during the night, every earlobe had been transformed into a complete skin. These skins made him very wealthy, and he became a significant man in the village. For several years he kept his promise to his wife, and they were very happy. They had a son who was named Kinak, in memory of the giant. But eventually, the man relapsed into his old behavior and began to mistreat his wife again. One day he had an outburst of rage over some trifle, and he snatched up a club and threatened to strike her. The woman fled out of the house, but the man followed, struck her to the ground, and raised his arm to strike once more. The woman had almost forgotten the giant, but just then she happened to think of him and screamed, "Kinak, Kinak, help me, please." Hardly had she uttered the words before the sky darkened, and a violent whirlwind swept down over them. The man was lifted high into the air and swept away by the wind further and further until he finally disappeared from sight. So eventually the wind died down and everything became still. But the cruel man was never seen again. The woman remained in the village with her son Kinak, who grew up and became a stately young man, tall and strong. But alas, to his mother's sorrow and horror, he had inherited his father's bad temper, and he was constantly involved in quarrels and disputes. One day, he fell into a fight with two hunting companions over a seal, and killed them both with his spear. His mother was filled with horror when she heard tell of the terrible deed. "Your evil has brought shame and humiliation over the whole village," she said. "Now, you have truly put us in danger, for the relatives of those murdered will seek us out to take revenge. It would be best for everyone if you left here and never came back again." So Kinak left the village and never came back. By pure chance, he happened to take the same path as his mother had taken many years before, and eventually came to the giant's land. The giant was happy to see his old friend's son. He let the youth live on his face and build a hut from his beard, just as his mother had once done. He also repeated his old warning that if Kinak was concerned for his safety, he must not come too close to the giant's mouth. But the youth was stubborn and held danger in contempt, and he decided to explore the forbidden area. He made his way through the thin and tangled undergrowth that made up the giant's beard and eventually came right next to his mouth. In the same moment, the giant opened his lips and emitted a powerful gust of wind. The young man tried in vain to cling to the giant's mustache, but he was torn loose from the strong hairs and hurled high up into the air, where he disappeared among the clouds forever. Since that day, no one has seen the giant Kinak, and no one has dared to seek him out. It is said that he still lives high up in the north, and during biting winter nights, one can still hear his whistling breath in the swirling snow. Part 6. The Hare and the Otter. The Indians who hunted alone or in small groups among the tall, dark pines in the forests of the north had no difficulty imagining that they were surrounded by supernatural beings. The Kutchin and the Tanana hunters believed that if they heard a strange whistling sound in the forest, it meant that Nakani, a kind of evil spirit that resembled humans but possessed superhuman powers, was nearby. The Nakani kidnapped people whom they then made into slaves, and there were not many of those who had been captured who ever returned and could tell what had happened. The few who managed to escape were extremely distressed or insane after the dreadful captivity. The Indians tried in many ways to appease the spirits that influenced daily life, such as the spirits of the wind and snow, the spirits of the animals they hunted, and the spirits that ruled over the forests, lakes, and rivers in their surroundings. Many people wore amulets that would protect them or bring luck with them. It could be a stone or the skin from some small animal, but it was the shamans who best knew how one should control the spirits. And usually it was they who got to mediate for the others. Most shamans received their special knowledge through dreams, sometimes as early as when they were children. This knowledge gave them the power to summon the animal spirits and instruct them when they were needed for magical purposes, and often it was believed that they could speak through the animal or transform into animals. Included in the shaman's equipment were amulets representing the spirits they commanded, skins belonging to their spiritual helpers, and special bowls and spoons used in medical ceremonies. There were a variety of regulations regarding how one should kill an animal and how one should dispose of the bones and the meat that was left over. In the James Bay area, the first goose killed in the spring was particularly important, and its head was dried and adorned with beads and stored in a special place in honor of the goose spirit. Similar rituals occurred when killing wolves, wolverines, and lynx, but the most significant among the wild animals was the bear. When a hunter had tracked a bear, he spoke respectfully to it and asked for permission to kill it, explaining that it was nothing other than his need for food that made this action necessary. When the bear had been killed, it was brought home to the camp with pomp and ceremony, and a feast was held in its honor. The bones were placed on a special wooden frame, and the skull, which was sometimes painted and decorated with ribbons fast to a tree facing a lake or river, as it was believed this would appeal to the bear's spirit. Throughout this vast forest area, myths and legends varied considerably. In the western parts, there were many stories about the raven, which were reminiscent of the tales the Eskimos told. Here, too, the Indians told of how the raven came with the sun and filled the seas with fish. Further east by the Great Lakes, many tribes spoke with awe and respect of the great spirit Gitch-Manitou, a mystical force that permeated everything in nature. Despite Gitch-Manitou generally being regarded as the creator of all life and the origin of good, it was assumed he never took any visible form and he never appeared in any myths. On the other hand, there are many stories about the beings who came later, often after the earth was already inhabited, to shape it into how it looks now. This being has different names among different tribes. Some call him Gliskap, others Makabo, Manabojo, or Wisagatkak. But the legends show that whatever name is given to him, they usually refer to the dual being who so often occurs in North American mythology, namely the trickster creator. On some occasions, he appears as a wise and noble benefactor who performs good deeds for his fellow humans. At other times, he can be cunning, mean, deceitful, and behave like a real scoundrel. Sometimes, he is called simply the Great Hare, because he often takes the form of a hare. It was in this form that he, for example, stole fire from the people of the dawn. When the Dawn Man and his daughters found a small shivering hare in the snow outside the door, they felt sorry for it and took it into the warmth of the fire. But as soon as they turned their backs, the hare took a burning piece of wood from the fire and ran quickly away to the place where he had hidden his canoe. He paddled so fast that the wind resistance caused the fire to flare up and singe the hare's ears. That is why the tips of a hare's ears are always dark, regardless of what color its fur is otherwise, whether it be brown in summer or white in winter. But despite the hare being cunning, he is also foolish and easily fooled, and it is not unusual for him to get into trouble because of his schemes. One cold winter day, The hare wandered dejectedly through the snowy forest. He had left home early in the morning to look for food, but so far he had not found anything. In a clearing near the river, he spotted a lonely birch bark wigwam, and he drew hopefully closer in the belief that its inhabitants would show guest friendliness toward a weary wanderer. Just then, the otter appeared, and he carried a stout pole with a number of dangling hooks over one shoulder. "Good day, Brother Otter," the hare greeted him sadly. "This is a difficult season, don't you think? I haven't eaten for several days, and soon my ribs will stick out through my fur. I am sure of it." He patted his white, fluffy sides with his paws to show what he meant. The otter laughed. "It's not that bad for all of us," he said self-satisfiedly. "It's always possible to find food. You just have to know how to do it. Follow me. I'll show you how I go about it." The hare, who realized that a meal was near at hand, was not slow to accept, and he followed the otter down to the riverbank. From the shore slope, an ice slide led down to the water's edge. The otter sat down and slid smoothly down the ice slide and landed almost soundlessly in the water. Without effort, he glided around in the water, disappeared then and then under the surface, and soon he emerged with his arms full of fat, juicy eels. The hare was full of admiration when he saw the otter hook the catch onto the pole. "I must say," he said to himself, "that was a simple way to solve the food question." To the hare's delight, the otter invited him to share the meal, and they returned to the otter's wigwam with the pole, which was now so heavy they had to carry it between them. The otter's wife already had a pot boiling over the fire, and soon she had cooked a fragrant eel stew. The hare ate with good appetite until he couldn't get another bite down. Finally, he leaned back with a sigh of satisfaction. "Think how well some live," he thought, and wiped the sauce from his whiskers. "If the otter can manage it, can't I as well? I am sure I can catch eels just as well as he can." And certain of the success he would soon achieve, he politely invited the otter to dinner the following evening. When the hare came home to his grandmother, whom he lived with, she was waiting impatiently for him, as there was nothing to eat in the house. When she saw that he hadn't brought anything with him despite clearly having eaten himself quite full, she became extremely angry and let him know in well-chosen words. "Don't be angry, grandmother," said the hare consolingly. "Tomorrow we shall have a great feast, and I have invited the otter for dinner." "That sounds fine," the old woman snapped angrily. "But where will the food come from, if I may ask? We don't have a morsel in the house, and you don't seem to be much of a hunter." "Oh yes," said the hare self-satisfiedly. "Just wait, and you shall see what I have planned." And then he refused to say more about the matter. The next day, the hare began his preparations. First, he felled a small tree. Then he made some hooks of bone and lashed them fast to the tree trunk with skin strips. His grandmother watched him in amazement and wondered what in the world he was up to. Finally, when everything was ready, the hare said, "There now, grandmother. Now you can fill the pot with water and put it over the fire. Soon you will have plenty of food to cook." The old woman was still very skeptical regarding the promised feast, but she did as he said anyway. So she went with him down to the river to see what would happen next. With a birch bark bowl he had borrowed from his grandmother, the hare scooped up water from the river and poured it carefully down the shore slope. It was so cold out that the water almost immediately froze into a thick layer of ice. The hare climbed up the slope and slid down the ice just as he had seen the otter do. But the ice was not at all as smooth and slippery as the otter's well-used slide had been, and the hare's descent was anything but graceful. He thumped and slipped down the slope in lumpy jolts and finally tumbled into the water with a huge splash. The ice-cold water made him lose his breath. It forced its way into his eyes and ears, and when he was about to gasp for air, it also filled his mouth. He splashed around and struggled to keep his head above the water's surface. This was not his right element. Just then, the otter came walking by. The strange sight that met his eyes made him completely bewildered. "Isn't that your grandson down there in the river?" he asked the old woman. "What is he doing?" "I think he is fishing," the hare's grandmother answered with a grimace. "Presumably he has seen someone else do that, and so he thinks that he can also do it." "Hello, come up out of the water," shouted the otter. "Let me take care of that." Half drowned and shaking with cold, the hare crawled out of the water. The otter dove in and soon came back with quantities of eels. He hooked them onto the pole the hare had prepared and handed it to him without a word. "I will probably soon master the technique," said the hare, embarrassed, teeth chattering with cold. "I just need a little more training." "I wouldn't bother if I were you," answered the otter contemptuously. "It is clear that you are not suited for this kind of work." The hare's grandmother, who was worried that they would start to quarrel, interrupted them hastily. "We really have very much to thank you for, Otter," she said. "What abundance. I hope you want to eat dinner with us." The otter shook his head. "No thank you," he answered. "The hare's ridiculous display made me totally lose my appetite." And with long strides he disappeared into the forest. That evening, a lovely scent spread from the hare's wigwam when his grandmother cooked the eels. But the hare was so humiliated over his wretched failure as a fisherman and over the otter's scathing comments that he could hardly manage to taste the delicious dish she set before him. For several days he went around and brooded over what had happened, and finally he decided to take revenge on the otter. Under the protection of the tree trunks, he cautiously approached the otter's wigwam. Neither the otter nor his wife were to be seen. Quietly, he crept up to the tent and peeked in. There was no one home, but on a hook hung a bunch of freshly caught eels. He snatched the eels and rushed back into the dark forest. When the otter came home, he saw immediately that the eels were gone. He also recognized the hare's footprints in the snow and understood who the thief was. Furiously muttering and threatening, he took up the pursuit. The hare knew that the otter would easily be able to follow his tracks, so he decided to transform himself. One of the hare's most useful qualities was his ability to transform into anything at all, and now he transformed himself into a wrinkled old woman, sitting in a wigwam. Scarcely was it done before the otter appeared in the doorway. The otter became mute with astonishment when he found a little old woman sitting by the fire, for he had followed the hare's tracks all the way here and counted on finding him fast. "Have you seen a hare with a bunch of eels?" he asked her. "His tracks lead toward your door." "Hare?" croaked the old woman. "Hare? What is that?" "A little white animal," explained the otter, "exceedingly ugly, with long ears and a little stump for a tail." "I don't think I have seen any such animal," the old woman answered. "Unfortunately, I cannot help you. But since you are here anyway, perhaps you could do me a favor? I am so cold, and the fire is about to go out. Would you possibly want to gather a little wood for me?" The otter was eager to get away, but he could hardly refuse the old woman's pitiful request, so he set off to look for wood. When he came back, he could to his surprise find not the slightest trace of either wigwam or old woman. But there on the ground were, however, imprints of the hare's paws. The otter set off, and now he was more determined than ever to catch his enemy and take back the eels. Soon he came to another wigwam. At the entrance stood a young man polishing a reindeer horn club. "Has any hare passed by this way?" asked the otter. The man looked surprised. "Do you mean a quite beautiful animal with white, silky fur and long legs? Could it be the one standing behind the tree over there?" The otter turned around to look, and in the same moment he was struck by a stunning blow to the head and fell over. When he regained consciousness, both the young man and his wigwam were gone, and the otter realized he had been tricked once again. Meanwhile, the hare ran through the forest with the eel bunch trailing after him. He realized that he would not be able to continue transforming himself forever. Sooner or later, the otter would pin him against the wall, and he knew exactly what he should do next. In front of him, between the tree trunks, a lake shimmered, and a lonely fisherman glided peacefully across the water's surface in his birch bark canoe. A thought slowly began to take shape in the hare's consciousness, and he hid behind a tree. The otter came storming out of the forest down toward the water, and just as the hare had suspected, the otter believed the fisherman was only yet another of the hare's cunning disguises. Angrily screaming, he jumped into the water and set off at full speed toward the canoe. The fisherman saw what seemed to be a wild beast coming swimming toward him with bared teeth and gleaming eyes. and since his fishing spear was what lay nearest to hand, he hurried to hurl it toward the otter. Fortunately, it did not hit the otter, but it was enough to make him stop and start treading water. He saw the fisherman take his bow and draw an arrow from his quiver, and to his horror, he understood that he had made a terrible mistake. He did not bother to see the continuation, but dove down under the water's surface and swam at full speed in toward the shore. Well in safety, he climbed up to rest and recover from the shock. He decided for himself that he would not look for the hare any longer, even if it meant he had lost his eels. On the way home, he swore to never have anything more to do with the hare. Even the hare set off homeward. This time he truly looked forward to his eel meal, but he wondered if he should perhaps not focus on more easily accessible food in the future. But on the other hand, eels were so good, and if he practiced on his ice slide, then perhaps maybe, just maybe, it could work. Okay, I think that we will wrap up this episode here. I still have lots of North American fables to go through, so there will surely be more episodes shortly. I thought it was really interesting. Before I started work on this video, I didn't know much about North American indigenous people, so I have learned a lot, I feel. We do have indigenous people in Sweden also. They are called samer and are really cool. They dress in really colorful clothes and mostly work with reindeers. If I find some nice sources, I'll probably make a video dedicated to Smyrna's mythology sometime. Anyway, I just wanted to say thank you for watching, and as always, I hope to see you all in the next one.